Hello, welcome back to another episode of Podcasting for Latina CEOs. I am your host and your coach, Heidi de la Cruz. And today I want to share the opportunities that have been presented to me since starting my podcast. So, I want to talk about since starting my first podcast, The American Dream and the Eyes of Immigrants, because without that podcast, this podcast actually would have not existed, and I'll get into that shortly. And I'm doing this in hopes to inspire you and motivate you to actually start your podcast, because I know that when someone starts their podcast or they're thinking about starting their podcast, I've actually had that in their heart for a few years, because the same thing happened to me. And everyone who I have asked about starting their podcast, they said the same thing. Like, they had the nudge to start their podcast for years, and then they finally made the leap and started. And it was like the best decision that they ever made. One, because of how much fun it is to start the podcast and hear the feedback. And yeah, and just being part of the podcasting community is just, they're so supportive, but then also opportunities that have presented to them because they have their podcast that they never even thought about. And if you take my podcast launch course, there's actually 3 exclusive interviews in there with podcasters that they provide their journey of starting their podcast and why they started, and they provide tips, and they all say the same thing about like how much fun they're having and how glad that they are that they actually took the leap to start their podcast. Okay, so let's get into this. So I launched my first podcast, The American Dream and the Eyes of Immigrants, in April of 2022. Now, very shortly after that, I have mentioned before that I joined Facebook groups to find guests and then also be guests on podcasts to share about my podcast, and actually at the time too, to share about my poetry book, because I needed to market it that as well. And one of the groups that I came across was Women Who Podcast. Was it Women or Women in Podcasting? Yeah, Women in Podcasting, sorry. And so I got connected with the admin of the group, and she had the opportunity for to be a leader in the group. And so I was co-hosting a, I think it was bi-weekly, a networking event for podcasters. So we would go on Zoom, and then we would share, like, you had like 2 minutes to like share who you were, what your show was about, and either if you were looking for a guest or if you wanted to be a guest, kind of very quickly like that. So I was able to co-host that networking event for podcasters very shortly after I started my own podcast, which is really cool. And then that was in 2023. So then towards the end of 2024, I actually started getting invited. Well, I started pitching myself to speak. But actually, before I get into the speaking events, yeah, before that, I did actually have the opportunity to apply for 2 internships. This was in 2024, for podcasters. So one of them was a long-term podcast that I used to listen to that is no longer active, but she sent out an information in her newsletter about needing interns. And so I was like, well, I love this show. I listen to it like every week. I would love to be able to be an intern and learn, right? I really wanted to learn behind the scenes of what it takes to run a bigger podcast, because again, I was just starting, and she had her show at that time for almost 10 years. So that was her full-time thing. She was a podcaster, she was an author, writer, speaker. So like she was doing all the things. And so I wanted to see like behind the scenes what it took, and she had a whole team. It was like someone was doing graphics, she had an editor, she had an admin person. She just had so many people and helping her do different things in the podcast. And I was like, oh my gosh, like you have a whole team and I'm just doing this all by myself. Like it really put things into perspective. But I learned a lot. I was actually able to go through her course about starting a podcast. And even though I already had my podcast, I still did learn a few things within that course. So I was really glad that I did that. And then also, again, just saw all the behind the scenes, all the work that it took to run a podcast of her magnitude. But then also just getting that one-on-one with her was really cool. And towards the end of the internship, I remember like asking her, hey, can we have a one-on-one call? I would love to like ask you a few questions. So obviously I wrote down the questions that I had and things like that to like ask her how did she get to the level that where she was at. And she was very honest. It was like, just knowing certain people, and also just with time, the again, podcasting, like I said in the previous episode, is a slow grind. So just with time is how you will be able to grow your show. So after that internship finished, there was actually another opportunity that came up on Instagram to be an intern for another. She's a podcast, sorry, she is an online business coach, and she has a podcast, right? So she has internship opportunities in different areas depending on where you want to grow in your business. So if you want to grow as a writer, or if you want to grow as an author, if you want to grow as a coach, if you want to grow as a podcast, like she has different areas of her business that she can really coach you through. And so I was really interested again in the podcasting aspect of things. Again, a bigger show than what I had. So after the first internship finished, I applied for the second internship, and I got it, and it was really really cool. Again, I was first part of her content team, but then I asked to be moved to the podcast team, and so I got to see like the behind the scenes. Again, there was I think we were a group of 8 people for one podcast, and again I was just like, oh my gosh, there's so many people doing so many different things when it comes to the podcast, and I'm doing this all on my own. It's just putting a lot of things into perspective, but I learned a lot. I got business coaching, I got life coaching, I got to see a lot of behind the scenes. She also had online courses that I had access to as part of the internship, and that was really cool. Learned a lot, but you know sometimes we do have to do things for free to get knowledge and experience, right? Again, this was very early in my podcasting journey. I was at that time, I was not helping people start their podcast. I was actually trying to develop my course and develop how I wanted to help people start their podcast, which she was a big help in that as well. So now let's forward to the end of 2024. That is when I actually started getting speaking engagements because of my podcast. So the very first speaking engagement was actually an online one. And it was, nope, I lied. I'm totally lying. The very first speaking engagement that I got was actually at a networking event here locally. And it was a networking event geared specifically for Latinas. And I went to, I think, 2 other meetings, and then I shared about my podcast and my poetry book and what inspired the poetry book and the journey that I had gone through. And then they had asked me to be a guest speaker for one other networking event. So that was the first in-person speaking engagement that I got very early in my podcasting journey. And then after that, I also then from that networking event, I met 2 sisters who had a boutique, and they had a 2-year celebration for their boutique, and then they asked me to be a keynote speaker at their event, which I am so sorry, guys. If you're listening to this, I am so sorry, ladies. I did so horrible at that speaking engagement. I was not prepared at all, and yeah, I did really really bad, so I apologize for that. But again, that was early in my podcasting and speaking career. And then after that, I pitched myself to be on the Latinas in Podcasting Virtual Summit. And I wanted to teach about podcast SEO. So I pitched myself, and that was actually my first online speaking engagement. And then from there, I just started like pitching myself to be on other speaking events, online, in person. I've been on panels, I've been a keynote for an online I've been on panels, I've been a keynote for an online Hispanic Heritage Month event. And just this past week, I was actually a facilitator for a panel at the Bessie's boardroom. So I facilitated the podcast panel. And actually, at that event, I met someone who was actually at the boutique event. Oh my gosh, that was crazy. So a friend of hers had invited her to the event, and I had and the friend and I had connected, and so she was like, "Oh, you need to meet my friend." So then she came, and I'm introducing myself, and she was like, "Your face looks familiar," and I'm like, "What?" She was like, "Yes, I've seen you before." And I'm just like, "Oh my god, where?" And so she was like, it was like at this fashion thing. It was like in downtown DeLand. And I'm just like, girl, what? Yes. And again, that was like over 3 years ago. So she like remembered my face. And I was like, I really hope you don't remember my speech because I did really, really bad at that. And she was like, no, I don't remember the speech, but I remember your face. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm unforgettable. That did that little joke. Needless to say, like I've had different opportunities that have come up because of my podcast, because again I'm teaching others how to start their podcast. I'm in the immigration space. I'm also talking about immigration. Last month I had the opportunity to be on an immigration panel with a bishop and a pastor, and we talked about podcasting. No, we didn't. We talked about immigration. We talked about current events and things like that, and the whole theme of it was what is God's heart for the immigrants. So I came in with my storytelling aspect of things and what I'm listening to and hearing from immigrants share their stories on the podcast. And yeah, and then obviously I've been a guest on other podcasts, sharing my story, being interviewed, using other, podcasts as a marketing strategy for my own show and things like that. So, I've also have been featured in online magazines. I've been featured in a few. So again, doing interviews for these online magazines about my podcasts and about the work that I'm doing with immigrants and things like that. So it's just really, really cool to see these opportunities come up because I decided to take the leap of faith in what God had was calling me to do to start the podcast. And yeah, when I think back of this journey in these short 4 years, you guys, it's only been 4 years. And again, just have done so much, speaking at conferences, having breakout sessions, speaking virtually, hosting my own master classes and speaking and teaching and going to networking events. And it's just really, really incredible to see what God has been doing in all of this and all of that just because I took the leap of faith of starting the podcast. And the opportunities honestly are endless. Like, I am pitching myself now to speak at more conferences and bring my voice method workshop to conferences so then people can walk away with tangible things to start their podcast. And again, if you have been thinking about it, just do it. I'm here to help you. You're not going to do it by yourself. You you may think that you're just starting a podcast or you're just starting an online business, but so much more will come out of starting your podcast. All right. All right. I don't want this episode to be too long because I actually do have another episode planned out of like the exact roadmap of how I've been able to use my podcast to get speaking engagements. And I want to go into like details of that. So this one is just to share a little bit of the opportunities that have been presented to me because I started my podcast in hopes again to motivate, to inspire, to pretty much lit a fire in you to start your podcast. Because if it's in your heart, God put it there for a reason, and He wants you to use your voice in helping people and sharing your story and connecting with others. Okay. All right. I am done. The call to action for this episode is again, if you want to start your podcast, the links to the ways that you can start it will be in the show notes. So again, one-on-one coaching with me or one-on-one podcast strategy with me. There is the voice method workbook, and then there is a voice method podcast course that you can take at your own pace. All right. If you have any questions, I forgot to mention this. If you have any questions whatsoever, please send me an email, Heidi@HeidiDeLaCruz.com, or in the show notes, you'll see this thing on that says send a text. So you can actually send me a text message. Buzzsprout is the one that has that option. You can send me a text message with any question and I will answer it on the show. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I am so glad that I get to with you through this journey, and I'm so glad that you are here. And we'll see you next time. Con mucho amor, Coach Heidi.